John Dugardy, also known as Johnny Dio, was a prominent figure in organized crime during the mid-20th century in New York City. Born on April 29, 1914, in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, Dugardy grew up in Little Italy and was introduced to the world of organized crime at a young age by his uncle. He became involved in various criminal activities, including labor racketeering in the garment district, under the tutelage of mob leaders such as Lucky Luciano and Tommy Gagliano. John Dugardy and brother Tommy were working for both gangs. He also associated with hitmen and labor racketeers Lepka Buckalter and Garage Shapiro. With Plumeri and another gangster, Dominic Diodato, Dugardy established and ran a protection racket in New York City's garment district. He was arrested several times between 1926 and 1937, but never brought to trial. In 1934, Dugardy was executive secretary of the Allied Truckmen's Mutual Association, an employer association, and represented the employers during a strike by 1,150 Teamsters in September 1934. In March 1937, Dugardy was arrested on charges of extortion, conspiracy, and racketeering. He pleaded guilty and received a 3-year prison term in Sing Sing. After his release from prison, Dugardy moved to Allentown, Pennsylvania, where he established a dress manufacturing plant. He later sold the plant and set up a dress wholesaler operation in New York City. Dugardy also dabbled in stock investing, real estate, and trucking. Dugardy later returned to New York to live again on Forsyth Street. He married Anne Crosstack and had 2 sons, Philip and Dominic, and a daughter, Rosemary. Philip later was a soldier in the Colombo crime family. Dominic became a soldier in the Lucchese family. Labor racketeering in the 1950s. In 1950, Dugardy returned to labor racketeering. He was appointed regional director of the United Auto Workers and received 12 charters for paper locals in the garment industry. Criminals formed the membership of the paper locals. And Dugardy demanded money from employers who wished to remain union-free and extorted cash from unionized employers who wished to avoid strikes and other labor troubles. Dugardy was arrested for extortion in July 1952. Although Dugardy was never convicted for this labor racketeering incident, he was removed from his post in February 1953 and ejected from the Union in April 1954. In the midst of the 1952-54 labor racketeering scandal, Dugardy was charged with tax evasion. New York State tax officials charged that Dugardy had taken a bribe when selling his Pennsylvania dress factory and failed to report the bribe as income. Dugardy denied the charge, but he was found guilty in March 1954 and sentenced to 60 days in prison. This conviction, rather than the allegations of labor racketeering, was the basis used to remove him from his position. McClellan Committee revelations. Activities in Labor and Management was a committee created to investigate corruption in labor unions and employers. Dugardy, who by this time was in prison serving time on bribery and conspiracy charges, was paroled by a federal court in order to testify at the Select Committee's hearings. Dugardy testified about his involvement in labor racketeering, specifically detailing his connections to organized crime and its influence on labor unions. He provided insights into how these criminal elements were able to infiltrate and control certain unions, engage in extortion, and manipulate labor activities for their own gain. Dugardy's testimony was crucial in exposing the extent of corruption within labor unions during that period. Role in Victor Riesel acid attack. In the midst of the Teamsters paper locals scandal, Dugardy was indicted for planning the acid attack on crusading newspaper columnist Victor Riesel. At 3 a.m. on April 5, 1956, an unknown assailant threw a vial of acid into Riesel's face as he left a late-night interview at Lindy's, an attack which left the journalist permanently blind. The FBI identified Abraham Telvey as the assailant in August 1956, but Telvey had been murdered on July 28, 1956. by mobsters for demanding an additional $50,000 on top of the $500 he had already received for the crime. On August 29, 1956, Dugardy was arrested for conspiracy in the Riesel attack, pleaded not guilty, and was released on $100,000 bond even though prosecutors later publicly linked him to the Telvi murder. Dugardy was tried separately for the attack on Riesel. Joseph Carlino, the Dugardy associate who had hired Telvi to attack Riesel, pleaded guilty on October 22, and prosecutors severed Dugardy's trial from the others. Carlino later testified that Dugardy had ordered Gandolfo Mariantai to find a hitman and identify Riesel, and that Mariantai had contacted Dominic Bando to assist him in finding the hitman. Mariantai and Bando were found guilty. Conspiracy charges against Dugardy were later dropped despite the convictions. Dugardy's attorney delayed the trial for nearly 5 months with motions. When the trial finally began, Carlino and Mariantai recanted their pre-trial statements and courtroom testimony, claiming they did not know who had ordered the attack on Riesel. By September 1957, the government no longer sought to prosecute Dugardy for the attack. Extortion and tax evasion trials. Dugardy's legal troubles worsened during his trial for the Riesel attack, when he was indicted in October 1956 on extortion and conspiracy charges. The indictment alleged that Dugardy and others had extorted money from truck drivers in the New York City garment industry and received bribes from employers in exchange for refusing to call strikes. Dugardy was convicted of extortion in July 1957. Key prosecution witnesses again recanted their testimony against him. The special jury considered the case for 9 days, but nonetheless found him guilty on July 25, 1957, and he was sentenced in September to 2 years in prison. As Dugardy was awaiting sentencing in his extortion case, a federal grand jury indicted him on tax evasion charges. Dugardy denied the charges and again sought lengthy trial delays, but the government halted the trial. The reason for the tax trial delay soon became apparent as state charges on extortion and conspiracy were once more brought against Dugardy. The charges had originated in June 1956, but Dugardy had never been prosecuted. With the collapse of the Riesel case, state officials finally decided to act on the 1956 indictment, and Dugardy's second trial for labor racketeering began 2 days after his tax evasion trial halted. Dugardy's tactic of delay was denied once more, and he was quickly found guilty on both charges in December 1957. He was sentenced to 15 years in Sing Sing and began serving time on January 10, 1958. However, Dugardy appealed his conviction, and on June 23, 1959, a New York State appellate court reversed his conviction. Within an hour of his release from state prison, however, Dugardy was rearrested on federal tax evasion charges. His tax evasion trial began in March 1960. He was found guilty a month later, and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Later life and legal troubles. Dugardy's state sentence on extortion and conspiracy ended in June 1959, and he entered federal custody to serve his sentence for tax evasion. He was paroled in 1963 and went to work for Consumers Kosher Provision. Stock and bankruptcy fraud trials. In April 1966, Dugardy and his son, Dominic, were indicted for bankruptcy fraud. Consumers Kosher filed for bankruptcy in January 1965, and Dugardy ordered his son and Plumeri to sell more than $33,000 in raw and processed meat assets and disperse the money received to Dugardy and other mob associates. Dugardy was convicted on November 10, 1967, and received a 5-year prison sentence. He appealed his conviction, but his appeal was denied, and he began serving his prison term in October 1970. While Dugardy's appeal and his bankruptcy fraud conviction was pending, he was indicted for securities fraud. A According to prosecutors, Dugardi and Anthony Di Lorenzo, heir apparent to the Genovese crime family, conspired to purchase 28,000 shares of Belmont Franchising Corporation. Dugardi, Di Lorenzo and others purchased shares of Belmont from themselves in an attempt to inflate the price. They agreed to sell the stock to other investors and then share the proceeds among themselves. Within a year, Dugardi was indicted again for stock fraud. Prosecutors alleged that Dugardi had conspired with Lucchese crime family to float $300,000 in fake stock in a service leasing corporation, a luxury car leasing company which did extensive business with organized crime figures. Under the scheme, Dugardi and the others bribed securities dealers to sell the stock and then pocketed the money paid by investors. Dugardi was convicted and given sentences of 10 years and 9 years in prison to run concurrently. Dugardi appealed his conviction, but a federal appellate court upheld his conviction. A second appeal was also made, but his conviction was upheld again. Death. Dugardi's last years were spent incarcerated at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. He was increasingly in ill health in the 1970s. He had applied for parole during his stock fraud trial, arguing that his poor physical condition made prison cruel and unusual punishment, but his parole request was denied. Dugardi appealed the decision of the parole board, but a federal appellate court upheld the parole board's decision in August 1978. Dugardi's health became precarious. A few weeks before his death, he was moved from the federal prison to a local hospital. Dugardi died in the hospital on January 12, 1979.